Hello and welcome. I'm Peter Baldaya, Director of Curatorial Affairs for the Huntsville Museum of Art, and I'm here today with my colleague, David Reyes, Curator of Exhibitions and Collections for the museum. We're pleased to be hosting the museum's 8th virtual artist studio visit in connection with an exhibition of recent acquisitions to the collection that is currently on view at the museum through October 31st, 2021. Thank you all for joining us. Our guest today is featured artist Michael Baggarly of Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Now, some of you may remember that his sculpture, Fractious Division, which you see on your screen, was featured in the most recent version of our recurring Red Clay Survey exhibition of contemporary Southern art, which David and I actually juried. Well, we liked this piece so much that we gave it a purchase award. So now it's in our permanent collection and is prominently featured in the recent acquisitions exhibition currently on view at the museum. Before we begin, I want to give a quick thank you to the sponsors of the exhibition, the Alabama State Council on the Arts and the Huntsville Museum of Art Guild. I also want to remind everybody that during the course of the program, you can use your Q&A button on the bottom of your screen to type in any questions as we proceed, because we'll want to get to some of those towards the end of the session. And now I'll hand the program over to David Reyes, who will introduce today's artist, Michael Baggarly. David?
Thank you, Peter, and good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Michael Baggarly. Michael is an associate professor of art at Middle Tennessee State University, where he teaches sculpture and 3D design. Born in 1970 in Hartford, Kentucky, Michael lives and works in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. He earned a BFA from Western Kentucky University in 1998 and his MA and MFA degrees from the University of Iowa in 2001 and 2002. Michael Baggarly is known for creating labor-intensive sculptural objects with lush, inviting surfaces of metal, wood, and fiberglass that often contain spikes, thorns, or quills. The protruding barbs are visually graceful, beautiful, and dangerous. This juxtaposition of aesthetic beauty with overt visceral danger creates a tension in the work that mirrors the dynamic of interactions with the outside world, where one must be open yet guarded. Michael's work attempts to find equilibrium between the two extremes. Michael's art has been exhibited in numerous nationally and internationally juried and invitational exhibitions. His work has appeared recently in the Gale Contemporary Art Museum in Gyeonggi-do, South Korea, Sloss Furnaces in Birmingham, Alabama, Lemieux Gallery, New Orleans, Louisiana, and Southern Kentucky Performing Arts Center, Bowling Green, Kentucky, just to name a few. His works are also included in the permanent collections of the Tennessee State Museum in Nashville, the Learning Connection, Wellington, New Zealand, Museo de Collage, Morales, Mexico, as well as our own Huntsville Museum of Art. We are pleased to have with us today, Michael Baggarly.
Thank you, David. I appreciate that. I'm going to kick over and share my screen. While I'm doing that, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I want to thank the Huntsville Museum of Art. I want to thank Peter and David. You've both been a great help to me. I appreciate all your assistance in getting this going, putting this together, and adding my work to your collection. It's a great honor for me. It really is. So I appreciate that. So, all right. Start off with a little bit older work. I've always been interested as a sculptor about interpersonal dynamics between, either couples or groups of people. And when I first came to MTSU in the early 2000s, these were some of the first works I started making. And they were chair forms. Chairs were body and absent for me. I mean, they have arms sometimes, they have legs, they have backs, they have seats, they have a lot of the same type of, structures that we apply to the human body. But they're also like a very site-specific place of interaction, whether it's around a table, within a group of people. For me, it was, a group of students within a classroom. So a lot of these chairs were found objects that were altered and changed and transformed so I could speak about these interactive moments I was having with students or colleagues, or even personal moments at home and abroad. Thinking about that, especially in the early 2000s, a big dynamic change for me. And I found out I was going to be a father. And, I'd never thought about that before, never contemplated that. And then when it happened, I was just scared to death. So my mind shifted into, I don't know, I had pregnant brain. That's what my wife would have called it. And I started making work that kind of dealt with the biological process of that. And this was one of the first pieces I made in the studio based on it. And this is 16 gauge hammered steel. It's 4 foot by 4 foot. And I essentially just sat down in front of a piece of metal with a hammer and started hitting it. Just hammer strike after hammer strike after hammer strike, dishing this metal out. And I was doing that. I mean, it was for many things, it was just a process at the beginning. I didn't know where I was moving this piece towards. But I started thinking these hammer strikes as cells, adding, accumulating, dividing, and splitting. And as I was doing this, I was dishing this form out. I started thinking, all right, that's where I'm going to go. I'm going to move this thing towards like this dividing human cell. So I worked very specifically building these 2 circular pieces with that really clean, sharp divide between that center section, like the cell budding out. For me, it was this complete uncertainty about how the future was going to move forward, especially with a new child coming into my life. I spent several years working with metal, dishing metal, hammering metal, and for me, it's a cold process. I'm not heating the metal or annealing the metal, which would soften it in some way. I'm striking straight on cold steel, and that takes its toll. After a certain point, I was having so much issues with my hands and numbness. I just had to give that up for a while. I had to redirect what I was doing. And so these circular domed metal forms became wooden forms because I didn't have to have a hammer in my hand the entire time. I didn't have to hit something thousands of times to form something out. I could go into the wood shop. I could, cut down a sheet of plywood and work with the tools there and let them do the abusive part of it. And so the next couple of pieces we're going to see is that jump out of the hammering sections. This piece is called echolocate. And for me, it was about finding self. And for me, I grew up with like radar screens, like, almost like you would see in these, like an airport somewhere, this green screen with these, these white, lighter areas of green and darker areas of green as this radar kind of kicks out. So as I was working on this piece, one of the first things I knew I needed to do was to split it up. I split a lot of my pieces. I break things down into smaller kind of components. I think for me, it's part of the process of the way I simulate life. I have to kind of dissect everything to kind of get an understanding of what I need to be doing next. And so often I will start off making a larger piece, and maybe a third of the way through it, I start dividing these sections up, splitting pieces up. And that's what I did with this. So I have 4 corners of direction, and they emanate at that center point. And then we have these rippling effect of these concentric lines cascading out. And the lines are actually cut into the surface of this, of the wood. And this is acrylic enamel and lacquer dye on wood. But the lines are etched in almost like you would see in a record player, this little slight deviation in that surface, this rippling out. And as it did that, and it started exposing some of the other components of the layers that I'd used to create colors underneath. So I had this kind of like atmospheric, radar detection thing kind of going on. So I really liked that, and pushed that with that green color, because I grew up with those old green CRT screens for computers. That was always something digital for me. 2 other components, or 2 other pieces in that series. Intake on the left. That is it's 90 inches. It's wall mounted. Has this beginnings of what I call my portal series. That center section just kind of cascading or moving in on itself, dropping down into the point where you can't see it, almost like this drain system. And convex uncertainty is on the right. Cardboard is the initial construction for this piece over a wood frame. I used archival cardboard. It was one of the first pieces in the series. So I thought I'm going to be smart. It's going to be light. It's not going to weigh very much. The cardboard's going to take care of this process. What I didn't anticipate was that cardboard was continually releasing and pushing down against the wooden frame underneath. So it was sagging essentially. So I was going back in with Bondo or body filler and adding into those sections to try to level this thing out. And it just kept doing it for some reason. I don't know if humidity in the air and moisture, but for whatever reason, that thing just kept settling. So these variations you see on that surface, these light and dark areas, I started finding out that the lacquer dye that I was using to color this piece would react differently with the layers of Bondo and the resin and the hardener that I would put into it. So I started planning for that in some ways to build this kind of very kind of shifting atmospheric depth to that surface. So I was happy for that, happy accident, I guess, so to speak. So. Probably around 2009, 2010, I was working, coming back to metal. I'd missed just the qualities of metal, the resistance, the resilience of metal, the tactile qualities, the rust. So I started looking for other ways to kind of approach it instead of hammering it. And this piece started forming. And this is about 400 plus steel wool pads that I just essentially rolled out, stretched out. And then at the ends, I would overlap another section of steel wool that I'd rolled out, and I would hammer those sections together. I found really quickly that steel wool, if you take a hammer, you can strike that and it'll bond those layers together. So I might have a piece that maybe was 20 some feet long, and I would attach it to one end, and I would put the other end into a drill, and I would twist these pieces up into these long little ropes. And I just started wrapping it, almost like if you had a bundle of rubber bands. I just started wrapping these pieces over and over and over, tying off on each one. And it slowly built up and built up and built up. And I had this basketball, it's 18-inch diameter ball of steel wool, and you could hit it and it had this weird resonance to it. So it was really odd to know that it was this fibrous looking thing that was completely solid, completely metal, and it still had this tonal quality that if you hit it, that kind of resonated through it. At that time, I had a family member that was going through a series of neurological issues. So I started thinking again about the failure of biology, a lot like when I first started thinking about it with before my first child was born. And I come across a term called macrophagia, which is essentially cells, they almost commit suicide. They just destroy themselves, they die. And this whole process, I was looking through this and I saw this weird, tendril looking cell formation in the slide image. And that kind of spurred me to kind of bring that type of quality back to this piece, and which was essentially just this ball. Now it had these other pieces that were starting to grow out and protrude and almost vine-like. So it carried that structure, that roping structure out from that center core out into space. And that's something that's stuck with me quite a bit, even into the work I'm making today, that we'll see here just in a few minutes. This is the first piece of iron that I'd cast. I cast this in Sloss Furnaces down in Birmingham, which is a great facility, a great organization. This is cast iron and hammered steel. So those steel wool tendrils coming off the form earlier all of a sudden became 1/4-inch steel rod that I was grinding down in the studio and then hammering with a hammer, heating these pieces up, hammering these sections, changing and creating these curves. I like that really aggressive push-pull between the surface, which is really inviting. The variations of the rust, the darks and the lights, the browns, the ochres, the grays, they really, if you're close to this, you really want to pull into it. But then there's these protrusions coming out that kind of keeps you back. And they're extremely sharp. I mean, they're very sharp. So you're at this quandary of, do I get close? Do I push back? And I find that in my own relationships that it mimics that in many ways. This idea, do I want to be a part of that? Do I not want to be a part of that? So these thorns, these tendrils, these spikes have become the metaphor for that situation for me moving forward. Always looking for spikes. I was on a walk around Murfreesboro a couple of years ago, and I saw these trees on the side of the greenway, and I'd never seen them before. I grew up in Kentucky, and we didn't have honey locust trees, or at least in the area where I was at. But there was these massive long thorns sticking out all over these trees, and I thought, oh my God, look at those things. I couldn't imagine running into one of those things, walking through the woods. So of course, I had to go back the next day and start harvesting these things. So I was in there clipping these things off. And at first I had gloves on, but gloves don't work because they just hang into everything. So I really have to kind of harvest these things by bare hand. And so I'm always getting poked and shocked by these tips of these pieces. So this is words unspoken. So it's cast bronze, honey locust thorns, and carved text. And the carved text was actually, this piece, the bronze, started out as wax. This is a simple sheet, and I just started pinching it like I would a pinch pot for clay. And after these forms were kind of made, again, these cellular kind of forms, I started writing things into the surface. I started etching, carving into the surface of the wax, and writing things that I would like to say, but I probably shouldn't. I hold it in, I keep it back. And so I put it on the surface, and through the obfuscation of, the thorn sticking out, the patina of the surface, the addition of these little 3D printed parts that I pushed into the wax, it kind of obscured what was being said. But when you get up close, you start finding the words, you get bits and pieces of things. And you can keep pushing, you can keep hunting, you can, want to get deeper, but then the thorns eventually becomes the detractor. It keeps you back from being able to have the full message or the full impact of what's said. This piece was actually cast at the same time as fractious division that we're going to look at in a few minutes. This piece is called Schism. It's cast iron, it's perforated steel, and again, I'm using those honey locust thorns. It's wall mounted, and for some reason, I don't know why I didn't think of it at the time, somebody said, oh, that looks like a brain, two halves of a brain. I'm like, oh, I guess you're right. But I didn't think about that when I was putting it together. I was really thinking about two things sliding against each other, rubbing against each other, with either one shearing the other away, maybe like the silver side, the left side shearing these thorns away, clearing that path, or the right side pushing back and pushing this other piece down and out. All right, that was the thought I had in my head at the time. But after somebody said brain, I couldn't get it out of it. The two hemispheres, just two sides looking at that, which I'm perfectly fine with. But for some reason, consciously, I didn't pick up on it at the time. Subconsciously, probably so. But that was the thing for me. I'm really interested in this idea of this push, either pushing back and pushing out and losing this, or, shearing this and creating a clean slate. So if you look in the bottom right, the perforated sections of that metal, those open sections right there, for me, it was almost like a cheese grater type of situation, routing or carving those surfaces back away. But I think now, looking at this thing for a while, I'm really kind of fixated on the idea that these thorns are pushing the other piece away. They're the ones that's winning for me in my mind, looking at this piece now. So close-up section of fractious division. This was cast in Sloss also, and it laid in my studio for a few years. And I have a bad habit of that I get this idea, and I know I want to make this piece. I want to use these materials. I want to work in this direction. And I get started, and then I'm like, all right, I don't know what I want to do with this, and it's going to have to set for a while. So this set for probably 2 or 3 years in my studio up against the back. And it laid there, and we would have a conversation every so often, this iron cast pieces and myself, but we never really came to a resolution until I really found the honey locust thorns as a possibility of a new material to bring into what I was doing as an artist. Here's a top view. I just brought it home. I just cleaned it up, and I just set it to the side, and it, just waited for me. And I'm all right with that. I don't like rushing things. I like to take my time before I feel like I have an understanding of where I need to go. Like I said, these thorns really offered up this brambled wall, this deterrent, this protector, this, initiator, I guess, in some ways, led me to be able to think about adding these pieces in. And this is when I was first started adding these pieces. I was gluing them in using this dark black epoxy, bringing them into that surface. And they seemed like it seems like the projection that I was always looking for. You know, the surface of the metal, the iron, this rust back, that iron oxides, as this oxidation occurs. And then almost a similar type of oxidation in how the wood was changing. These thorns were changing and aging and weathering. It seemed like, you know, it was really an extension of that iron in many ways. It just felt right. And I knew I had what I needed to kind of push this piece forward. Here's the larger view that you were seeing. Again, coming back, you know, I was talking about this kind of interconnectedness between people or individuals. I'm thinking the same thing here, except I'm thinking in the division, you know, fractious division. You know, this is being, you know, it's made in 2000, early 2000, and the political landscape is very divided, as it still is. So with that in mind, you know, I approached this piece in the sense that these corner sections would be their own little divided camps. You know, everybody kind of, you know, pointing, you know, sticking, you know, poking back out at each other, you know, keeping, you know, each other away. With that in mind, this piece is never going to come together. It's not going to unify in the way that it was. It's not going to be whole again. But in this kind of standoff, this kind of push back and forth against each other, it's kind of creating its whole new form. And I don't know if that's a good thing, this new thing that it's becoming, but, you know, I was thinking about these, again, these little tendrils like reaching out. And yeah, at some point they're kind of poking at each other, but as they grow, they're eventually going to be merged into this new thing. You know, they're going to grow in almost like a bone healing in some way, you know, a fracture healing and, you know, netting itself back together, stitching itself back together in some way. And so we had this new hybrid. So that was my kind of thought process and moving forward in fractious division. I needed the iron. I needed the primal qualities of that as a material, and I needed the fragile kind of dangerousness of the thorns for these things to really kind of pull it off. So I'm very happy with how this piece turned out. Quick close-up. I've shifted gears again. We were talking about this just before we started up. I've been doing a lot of 3D printing. 3D printing seems to be, I've always been a tech guy. I love tech. I love digital things. So 3D printing seems to be a nice little thing that I can bring into my world as another tool in my shop. And this is a quick picture of a piece that we'll see in a minute. It's called Ladylike. And it's, you know, a lot of people I think make the assumption that, oh, it's 3D printed. It's a quick kind of process. But it isn't. I spend more time sanding and putting and completing these surfaces than I did maybe when I was working with the metal pieces. So it's a different type of maybe aggravation, but in a good way. You know, it's like, you know, fighting with this, getting it forward. I find myself just as strict in my expectations on how these pieces are completed as I did with any of the metal or the wood pieces. Flip over. Putting the surface again, you know, trying to remove. There's times where I want the nature, the language of the printed piece, these little thin layered lines of the PLA, the polylactic acid, the plastic that I'm using. But often it's denying that and shifting that and making the viewer have a different experience, think about these in a different way. For me, I didn't want to think about metal. I didn't want to think about wood. And then I started thinking about bone. I started thinking about that yellow kind of tan surface of bone kind of extruding out. And it just so happened that I had a whole set of these porcupine quills, but I'm always grabbing things that are pokey. So I had these things, and then by luck, by chance, they actually matched up. I mean, they were so close to that bone-like color of that surface of that form for Ladylike. Again, it felt, you know, I felt resolved. It felt like, oh, another extension out off of this material. And it wasn't just in the color. The surface of these African porcupine quills are really shiny and slick. They seem like they're some type of plastic, even though they're completely natural material. And hence Ladylike was formed. And I built this in homage to my daughter in so many ways. Ladylike. I think sometimes it's given as maybe a term that's maybe not meant in the best ways. But for me, I thought it as a term of empowerment. I want my daughter to be ladylike. I want her to be strong. I want her to be fierce. I want her to be independent. I want her to have self-ownership of her own body. And that was this piece for me, that extension of these pieces, or this piece, these thorns kicking out, this form, which is, I think, really graceful, very subtle, but I think also at the same time, very powerful and strong. So, and I'm still working with that type of vein, that type of mentality, but they're starting to change. They're becoming what I kind of consider these portal pieces. And this is a quick shot of the digital screen that I'm using sometimes when I'm building my printed forms. And this is one of the newer pieces I've actually completed. So I'm going to step you through it just pretty quickly, keep us on track for time. This is the digital version. I'm forming this on screen through a program called Shaper 3D, which I highly recommend, love it. They don't sponsor me, they should, but they don't. This is the first sections of printed pieces coming off of that. You see the internal sections and pieces being put together. I try to make these in a way that they're not completely solid, but they have areas that are open but strong. So there's a lot of kind of engineering that kind of goes on the backside of these forms. And lots of glue. Cyan acrylic crazy glue is a great bonder for PLA as a material. I mean, it just really just permanently bonds these pieces together. It's so great. So I'll end up going in, I'll dry fit everything together. And after I know that everything is fitting the way I need it to, I'll switch back over and start permanently affixing these pieces together and putting that outside surface and begin sanding it. You can see that on that right side as I'm sanding in those sections. Once that's done, the easy part, the hard part starts coming. I'm really picky about surface. So I'll spend, I might spend a couple of weeks just thinking about surface, and I'll go through many variations on that. I'll add layers, I'll sand layers back, I'll add other layers, I'll sand that back. So it's never one size fits all when it comes to completing these surfaces. And it's a test run right here. I was adding in a metallic base paint, and it was just too drab and flat, and it just really didn't work for me. So I kept working with that. Started adding some different patinas. I was adding copper nitrate and trying to build this rust surface. I really like that rust starting to push out and move forward. And I kept messing with it. And eventually I came up with this solution, this really strong red oxide surface, that center section. If you look at the very bottom of the center section where this black rectangular passageway opens up, you can see that darker section is the areas, like water running through, staining that over time. So I like that sense of patina, that sense of age, that sense of relevancy for me. And then it's offset against that black rectangular section. I was talking about these pieces being portal pieces earlier. And that's what they are. For me, they're like doorways. They're liminal spaces. When I'm viewing this piece, I'm not here. I'm not on the other side. I'm in this place in between. And so for me, I wanted that to be this element of danger. So these stainless steel spikes protruding through one side and jutting out on the other, but not blocking the center sections, that passageway being open. Still, no matter what the difficulties are, there's a way through. It might be narrow, it might be difficult, but there's a passageway through to this other side, this other section that way. Let me switch this over. There's another view of that. So 3D printing for me it's not a be all and end all. I'm not a purist in any way. I'm very reactive to materials. I'm reactive to surfaces. I think about materials like a painter would with color. I'm telling a story. I'm picking and choosing on how these interact with each other, so they lead or lend themselves or create context for the viewer when they integrate themselves with it. Viewer. So yeah, so that's where I'm at currently with some newer work. So
very cool.
Interesting. Michael, I have a question. You're obviously very process oriented as a sculptor, and we can see through what you've just shown us how the pieces evolve as they are being made, and you're moving around between different materials, but not so much with the 3D printed work because we can see sort of the modeling happening, but with the earlier works, do you start off with concept sketches, or do you just have a general idea and then the piece kind of morphs as you're working on it?
It's a really good question, and I would say this applies itself to all the work I do, even the 3D printed, because it's not as rooted into its final form as you might think. I start off with notes on a notepad. I start off with quick little stick figures or rough, drawings. And it's really just for me to be able to hold a concept. And from there, I have to start building and sketching dimensionally. I play in my studio like a kid. I drag things out of the corners and I set things on top. I stack things upside down. I really go through a really formal process trying to figure out conceptually about how I want to move this piece forward and create, what I want to say about it, the dialogue I'm wanting to have. I'll do that in my 3D printed pieces as well. I mean, I'll print things out. And even the last piece that we're looking at, that's probably the 5th or 6th variation of me bandsawing something in half, adding other pieces back in, 3D printing something else as a new connector to go back into it, and then deciding, no, I can't do that, and going back to something else. But they're always going through. I tell my students all the time, I like options. I don't like getting stuck thinking that I know what I, need, because my interaction, this intimate kind of approach to working materials usually changes my direction. It doesn't alter it completely, but it guides me in a way that I never anticipated. So it really is a hands-on approach in refining that. So
yeah, I could see that process is key. And that's where the excitement lies, in the process and as you're going through and discovering and making connections and corrections. Speaking of process, I know that you've got another PowerPoint to show us aspects of your studio. So why don't we take a little tour of your studio through those images, Michael?
Okay, let me bring it up. Let me bring up the right one. How about that? So. Here we go. Okay, this is my actual studio at home. I was telling David and Peter before that I'm a nomad right now. I've taken over the interim chair position for the art department. So a lot of the time that I would have had at home, I'm actually now back here at the university quite a bit. So I'm kind of between worlds, so to speak. And a lot of what I'm doing right now is actually side by side with the students. This is the beginning of a piece I'm going to show you. This is cast just before COVID hit, the summer before COVID, and I was at Sculpture Trails in Salisbury, Indiana. And Sculpture Trails is an outdoor sculpture trails museum, but they also have a really great component led by Jerry Massey of casting iron and having workshops. So during one of the workshops over the summer, I cast a series of pieces, and we were using bonded resin sand, and this is the beginnings of the mold. These are the pieces after the pour. I am very happy to say that everything poured beautifully, very happy with the outcome. And then I shifted everything back to the studio, and it did again take that, I don't know, maybe I have to age everything first when I bring it home or something. I don't know what it is, but off to the side. And then finally I started putting these pieces together. And this is the beginnings of taking those portal pieces I've been talking about, which have always been, indoor pieces, always been in a museum space indoors or gallery space indoors. This is going to be the first piece that actually steps outside out into the, the open space. It's a little over, it's just under 5 feet in height. I don't know how much this weighs, it's pretty heavy. And it is from the 3D printed sections as well. Every piece of this was originally 3D printed and then created a mold from the bonded resin sand and cast in iron. Another view of it. I'm thinking about how to fill this center section right now. I've got the space. I've always known that there would be this other object. And in my mind, it's always going to be the spiky thing kind of protruding out from like these protective walls of this oval section moving out. But honey locust thorns and, porcupine quills won't last very well outside. So I'm moving back to thinking about metal, bringing that. And I'm using this perforated steel as the holder for these pieces. There are a lot of little circles in there that I didn't realize I had that many. So I'm in the process of grinding little spikes out of what they're called. They're just metal rivets. They're just like, it's like a screw with no threads on it. And I'm grinding them into points. And here they are. So I figured out I had to grind the heads on these things first to create a flat spot. So my drill will hold the flat pieces. And then after I've ground that, I can regrind these again and make them into these little points. So currently I bought a box of 3,000 of these things, and I'm going to have to grind each one of these twice, and I'm going to need more than 3,000. So if anybody wants to come and help me, I will give you my address. I'll take you for lunch. We'll do whatever, but I need help. So Peter, you're welcome to help too. And David, so you can help me out. I'm also back to working with wood. I'm going back to the larger wall pieces I was thinking about, but I'm shifting them off the wall and bringing them out into the space. And everything I build, all the wood pieces, they look like airplane wings. There are these hollow forms that are skinned. And this is the beginning of this one. Some quick interior shots as I'm building the structure, trying to keep this thing light but rigid at the same time. Starting to skin the outside on the left. And here's where I'm at right now. I've got skin pretty much over the outside and everything on the inside except the hard part, that curve that's going to arc through on that bottom and top section of both sides. And what I'll end up with is this I keep going back to intakes. They're like jet engines for me. It's like one thing gets pushed through and it gets thrown out of the other side, this kind of projection thing. So this center section narrows, it arcs and it kind of narrows in, and just before it closes back up, it opens again onto the other side. So it leaves you this really narrow space to move through the piece that way. But these are it's going to be a large freestanding piece. And I'll go back in once I've completed the surface on this, and I'll put a layer of fiberglass cloth and sand that down. It's almost like I'm building a car or something like that. So I think about Richard Prince and his hot rod hoods when I'm working on these pieces sometimes. A quick digital image. I'm modeling the pieces I'm going to show you next. And this is where I've got some little pieces here with me too. These 3D printed forms. It's almost like a bicycle wheel, sort of, without the tire in the center of it. And I'm making this large circular arc. And right now I'm thinking there are going to be two of these wheels that are going to be interlocking, and each of these wheels are going to have these large thorn protrusions all the way around, like this double halo of these pieces interlocking, and they're going to be this freestanding form that I've got going. Went back to sculpture trails this summer. Again, I can't say enough of good things about sculpture trails. So working, a lot of great interns helping us get these pieces done. You can kind of see a little bit of the process. The piece on the bottom left, you can actually see that the PLA pieces, the gray and the white sections at the bottom. The styrofoam in the top is just the gating system that allows the metal to get to these, these smaller sections. Iron doesn't move very well, so you have to really overgate it to be able to cast your pieces effectively. Piece on the right, I've added graphite to that surface to help with the release and also kind of protect the sand from burning into the surface of the iron. The iron's like 2,800 degrees when it's being poured. Piece on the side, starting to clamp this piece down so when the iron is actually poured into it, the mold doesn't expand and cause a spill. Air gates and pouring cups, everything's ready to go. I said earlier, it looked like Stonehenge to me in some weird way. These random blocks, I drilled holes into it to vent. And then here's the actual piece being cast. The iron crew was out there pouring these. They did a great job. Fabulous to watch iron being poured. Very successful. Everything came together.
Michael, can you hear
Yes.
me?
Yes.
I have one quick question.
Yes.
For those people who don't know about like sculpture and pouring techniques, could you just briefly say like what gates are, and also does that foam that was in there, does that stay in there, or does that get pulled out before the pour?
And I'm going to kick back just really quick, and I'll move back forward again. It comes out, and we can see that on this right side about how that's been removed. So we end up with this almost like clock-like dial face. And that area right there is the reservoir for when the metal will be poured into it. All right. And I'll show you the sections that we have to drill out. And then those little radial points sticking out, those are the gates, the delivery for that metal as it runs out and drops into that form. So it's a whole process of a cup and a reservoir and gates and your piece, and then air risers for everything to come back up. So when everything comes in, it goes out, it comes back up again, you know? So that's it in a nutshell.
Great.
So you can see the tape on the right-hand side here. That's where I've drilled the holes back in to create the air risers for the piece, and also the opening for the pour cup. And that's what these are. These are these little like Stonehenge pieces. Those are the air risers. And that large rectangular center section is where the main amount of the volume is being poured. So
Great.
Yeah, you can kind of see it there. The little points of light on the top of those sections as that metal moves up and through the piece.
Excellent.
And this is just some of the pieces that just came out, and they're still waiting for me to clean them up in the studio. They're hanging out, and I've got big plans, but knowing me, you'll get to see them in about 3 or 4 years. Now I have some immediate plans for these. I've got like a really quick direction on these. And now that they're cast, I know we were joking the other day saying, you know, why are you making wheels for? Because they look like wheels now. But all that center section right there will be cut away. All of that will be removed. And I'll be left with this. I'm left with this ring. This is the 3D printed piece that I use for the mold. So I'll be left with this. I'll be left with 2 sections of that that'll be added together. And I'll have the other pieces I'll be putting together, create that interlocking ring section. So yeah. All right. That's where I'm at right now.
Awesome. Actually, it's interesting that you talk about how it will be a bit of time before we see the final product, final sculpture. We've got a question here. How do you come back to a piece not touched in a few years? How do you begin the process of breathing life back into work when it has so much time has passed?
I think that's a good question. I think for me, I don't know if I really bonded with it, so to speak. You know, initially I brought it home. I guess I hope to be a good parent. I bonded with my kids, but my art pieces, maybe it's a different type of thing. I brought it back to the studio, and, you know, a lot of times I'm always questioning what I thought I needed. All right. I'm always questioning that. And I'll get to the point where if I can't bring myself to a resolution where I feel like I can start moving forward in a way that I think is productive to what I thought I needed out of the piece, I just won't do it. I just don't. I have time. I'm doing lots of other work. It can go set in the side. It can go set over in the corner. It can wait. And, you know, and sometimes, you know, my mouth is ahead of my mind sometimes in normal life. And sometimes when I'm making art, I get ahead of my mind. So, you know, I'm not ready for it yet. You know, I thought I was, but I'm not. And I'm happy to let things set. So I think for me, it's not that I had to come back to it and refine it again. I never found it in the first place. So now I'm at a point where I think I can meet that person and make a meaningful relationship out of this. Because, you know, when I'm in the studio, it's a relationship between me and the work. So, you know, but that's a really good question, though. I like the thought of that, but I don't think I have that difficulty for that reason. So,
okay. Carla asks, what artists have most influenced your work?
Osamu Noguchi was when I was an undergrad student. I was really admired the work, the clean, kind of concise kind of approach that he had of working with stone and materials. I like his blend between cultures. Who else would I say? Suk Jin Jo, she's a Korean artist who's a contemporary artist who's working now. I think her mindful practice as an artist and working with found objects and found materials, I think, is something that I appreciate. Found objects were one of my first transitions into sculpture, recontextualizing things, having a different dialogue. Martin Purrier, I can't get away from Purrier and his process. Tara Donovan, a pure process artist. I'm completely engaged with her taking, 60,000 Dixie cups and making this, crazy cloud wall form. I love the idea that she looks at the everyday and thinks about, well, how can I make it mine? How can I redo this? How can I make us rethink what we're doing? And I think, Hiroyuki Hamada is another artist that I'm really drawn to and attentive to how he approaches and makes his forms as well. So, and I've got a ton of them. Doho Su's another artist. I'm really, so there's a lot of them out there. So Richard Serra. So,
it's always amazing how many great artists there are out there.
There are, and it's,
words and get inspired by.
There is. There's a lot of ways. So
excellent. Let's see. We got another question here from Jane. Did you have to learn patience and faith that your own ideas and the materials you are drawn to will eventually make the product a unique piece of art? How did you control impulses?
I don't know. Maybe she can tell me. Patience. I get to a point where I really do honestly have the belief that that I can carry a piece to a fruition, and I feel really good about that because I'm open to taking a punch along the way. I'm open to changing course. I'm open to questioning myself about what I thought I needed. A lot of times I'll say something to myself and that becomes the game plan initially, but I lie to myself all the time, so I learned to question that really quickly as an artist. So, I feel like I'm versatile enough as I move through as an artist, I can eventually get to a piece to fruition and from the experience of doing it. But it comes to a point where I feel like I really connect, like talk about a relationship. I feel like I really went out on the date where I know this is the one, and then the real dialogue, the real relationship, the hard part starts then, keeping it together, moving it forward. So I believe in that. But that whole process is offset against the idea that patience is limited when I'm in the studio. I don't do it in here, and I don't advise my students, but stuff gets thrown all the time in the studio. I have to go through my tantrums because it's just me. I have a way to, kind of put that out. And I try to offset the kind of the chaos of that against the kind of orderly, kind of structured approach I use to create my work. I think I'm two halves to the same coin in that instance. It's really, my studio is usually kind of chaotic. I'm stepping over things. I'm, trudging over stuff. But the pieces I create I see them as minimal and thoughtful and quiet, which is not the case when I'm building them. So
I think that's very interesting because I see them as very resolved, very resolved, very refined, enigmatic, visually very appealing, thought-provoking. I love the tension in the use of the materials and in the ideas that are creating tension. I think your work is really beautiful. It has a lot of staying power. I didn't make the connection initially to Noguchi, but now I see it for sure. Great stuff. I can't believe we're out of time, but we are. So thank you so much, Michael. Very insightful talk and tour. I want to thank everybody who signed up for this session today. Be sure to join us again on September 24th, when we will visit watercolor artist Mary White from her studio in Charleston, South Carolina. Mary's exhibition, We the People, Portraits of Veterans in America, is currently on view at the museum through September 26th. You can sign up for that session now by going to the museum's website, hsvmuseum.org. Also want to remind everybody to come to the museum and see the recent acquisitions exhibition at the Huntsville Museum of Art, starring Michael's piece right front and center as you enter the Chan Gallery. That show is on view through October 24th. I'm sorry, October 31st. And so be sure to check that out before it closes. Again, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.